There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to B2B Growth. I'm your host for today's episode, Logan Lyles with Sweetfish Media. I'm joined today by Carlos Hidalgo. You'll probably recognize his name. He is a co-host here on B2B Growth of the Human to Human or hashtag H2H series. He is also the founder and CEO of VisumCX. He's a TEDx speaker, a marketing veteran, and one of the things we're going to be talking about today, the author of the new book, The UnAmerican Dream. Carlos, kick it over to you. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Logan. Always great to talk with you, and always a pleasure to be on the podcast, and a big fan of what you guys are doing in the B2B Growth, and have had a blast hosting the H2H segment. It is rather addictive to do these things because I learned so much from all the different guests. So thanks for having me.
It's awesome, man. Being a podcast host myself, as everybody knows, I've talked about it before, you get a master class in marketing or whatever topic you're interviewing guests on. So it's almost selfish and, like you said, addicting because you learn so much as you're creating with other folks. Well, like you said there, man, I enjoy every one of our conversations. And so for the first time, you and I getting to do it here for B2B Growth listeners is just an added bonus for me. So let's kick it off by talking a little bit about your background for folks that don't know you as well as James and I do. Give us a little bit of the backstory on yourself, and then we'll talk a little bit about the book today.
Yeah, so surprisingly, it kind of hit me, despite I know people can't see me, but despite my boyish good looks, I've been doing this for 25 years, which is crazy to think about. And I've had two very brief stints in nonprofit, which actually it was in nonprofit, which I started right out of school, where I really learned this whole idea around content and telling a story because I was in the office of donor development. And I remember early on, I was a kid fresh right out of school, where one of our consultants in fundraising, he said, look, if you really want to maximize the gifting that we're going to get from our donors, let's tell them good stories. Let's tell them about what we're doing. And I just remember thinking about that. And we didn't call it content then. Everything was copy, and we didn't have technology. So I started there. And then throughout my career, I fell into B2B. I never wanted to be a B2B marketer, which is sacrilege to some. Actually, my first career choice was law enforcement. And so I had applied to the FBI twice and done pretty well the second time, took the test. And then when they found out that Carlos Hidalgo does not speak Spanish, they wished me the best of luck. And so instead of going into law enforcement, I had 4 children. And so I've been here in Colorado for almost 10 years, married for 25 this September to an amazing woman, Suzanne, who also lends her voice to the book, and we can talk about that a little bit more. And so my journey through B2B was on client side with McAfee and BMC Software, learned a ton in those 2 roles, my first foray into international business and international marketing. And then I left BMC in 2005. And co-founded what is now known as Annuitas, and they are headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. Left that firm at the end of 2016, early 2017, and then just started another agency. But I did it differently this time and started VisumCX, really focused in on just helping companies who want to drive effective change in their organizations. And so here we are, almost 2.5 years later, still standing and doing a lot of different things that I really enjoy, and writing is one of those. And the book is I've had the time to really put thought and process into the book. And James was a big catalyst, if not the catalyst, to saying, man, you got to put this down on some pages. So here we are talking about it and getting ready for launch on June 24th.
I love it, man. Yeah, I've had conversations with James just between he and I as he was excited, getting off the phone with you, talking about the ideas that you wanted to share in this book and the very real and raw stories that people can learn from. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. I think as we dive into some of the things that you want people to take away from this book, The UnAmerican Dream, we should touch on that most recent transition that you talked about a little bit in your backstory, because there's something there in what led you to write this book as what you were going through and recognizing during that season of life, right?
Yeah. When we started the first agency in 2005, I did it because at that point with BMC, I had a global role. My children at that point were very small. I think my oldest son was 10 at the time. And I was traveling anywhere from 150 to 250,000 miles a year. Lots of global travel. I remember one quarter out of the 13 weeks I was on the road for 11. And there was an event with my 3-year-old that I actually referenced in my TEDx where I was just overnight in Austin and I called home. He picked up and he scolded me in essence by saying, "You're always in hotels, Daddy," and he hung up the phone. And so that was my moment. Yeah, it was crushing. When I talked about it in my TEDx, I got very emotional and it still stirs a lot of emotion in me. But so back in 2000, that was around 2004, that's when I'm like, I've got to make a change. And so we started Annuitas really at least for me personally, to be home more, to be involved. And that lasted for a very short period of time. And then things really started to take off with Annuitas. And I think where I found myself, so you take that in 2005 and fast forward to the end of 15 and 16. And what I had found was I had put everything I had emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually into building a business. And as human beings, we can't do everything well, and there's only so much time to go around. So as I put more and more time into my business and the more drive I had, I started to neglect my relationships, primarily the one with my wife, and then secondly, the one with my children. And so what happens is you can't cultivate a bunch of different things. And so I was cultivating what I thought was success. I wanted the American dream. And in the process, had deluded myself into saying, well, I'm doing this all for my family. The reality is my family didn't care what kind of business I had. They didn't care how much money we made. And obviously money does help, buy groceries and things like that. But they really wanted me home. And even when I was home, I wasn't present because I had bought into this hustle and this idea that if I don't do all of this, and it became an obsession. And what I found, especially as I came closer to my departures, the more success we had, the more I achieved both, as the CEO of Annuitas and then in the industry, gaining notoriety, making a name for myself, writing my first book, the less fulfilled I became. And I was surely becoming much more narcissistic in the process. And so my transition really was getting my life back and deconstructing the false self that I had established and look at what we are building with Annuitas versus what am I being gifted with at home? And let me go back and start to repair those relationships and put more into those relationships. Because at the end of the day, that's what brings true joy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Carlos. I feel this tension that you've talked about here just in the last few minutes between success, work, achieving what you set out to, and the very important aspect and the vitally important relationships of your spouse and your children. I'm a father of 2 as well, so I'm excited to dig into the content of this book and learn from it as well. Obviously, talking with you offline, I've already already been able to glean some, but I, like James, am excited that this story is going to be shared with more people more broadly. And I'm glad we get to start that today. So we're going to be talking about 3 big key takeaways that you wanted to share with listeners to give them a taste of some of the things in the book. And the first one, you already alluded to it a little bit there, and that's this definition of success. As you were driving hard after success, you had a wake-up moment or several wake-up moments along the way. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this definition of success.
Well, yeah, and I think that gets back to the title of the book. So James Truslow Adams was the one who coined the term the American Dream in his book, The Epic of America, back in 1931. So it's been almost 100 years. And when he talks about it, he talks about a land of opportunity for everyone, talks about it's not because of fortuitous circumstances, but that everyone can achieve. And what he specifically calls out in the definition, and he uses an old-fashioned term that we would never use today, but he says it's not just measured by the amount of motor cars, right? So he is referring to monetary wealth. Yet when we see today what is quote unquote success, or how we've defined the American dream, it's all about that. Like, what do you drive? Where do you live? How big's your house? What title do you hold? And maybe for me, well, not maybe for me, I think the way we've defined that today, it is quite un-American. So that's where the title came from. And then layer on top of that, I'm a son of an immigrant. My father came from Cuba in 1960 to flee the Castro regime. And so over the years, he has worked very hard and achieved great things. Now, is he, has he made enough money where he doesn't ever have to think about it again? No, but that's what he left in Cuba. My grandfather was very fortunate and very, very wealthy. But even my grandfather, and I have a story about him in the book, where after he left Cuba and was reduced to nothing, it never phased him. So really, for me, success is about freedom. Success is about independence, to do the things that I want to do. And so when we define it only from a monetary lens, it's very easy to see why we become slaves to our businesses or slaves to our work, because that's how we have to keep up with the Joneses. And there's so many influencers out there today that are posing in front of their jets or posing in front of their cars. And then you hear them at the same time talk about, if this is what you want, it's 95 hours a week. Well, where's the time for your health? Where's the time for your relationships? Where's the time for the hobbies that bring you joy? So that's really kind of defining success on your terms. And for me, when I left Annuitas, success looked like time with my wife, time with my children, time to take care of myself holistically, emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually. And those are the things that I've been able to achieve and still maintain a level of living that we in America, compared to the rest of the world, we're all pretty rich.
What you touch on there is so important, Carlos, defining success on your own terms and not on other people's terms or the common lingo or appearance throughout society, as you mentioned there. And it's not that you're totally throwing out hard work and business success as part of that. You need to be a successful professional in order to be able to carve out more time, in order to have some of that time and do some things with your family that you want. But if you're sacrificing them at the altar of work, then you're not getting to the point that you want to. So it's almost taking a step back, defining success in your own terms, and then working towards that. But so many people don't take the time to define that, and therefore reverse engineer what they want to have happen to get to where they want to go. And they end up somewhere just based on the momentum or inertia of their career or society, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not like I woke up one day when I started our first agency and said, hey, I would just want to repeat what I did at BMC and McAfee and be on the road all the time. Oh, and then let me add in this layer of immense ego and head swell because, people are calling me and recognizing my name or asking me to sign the book. It was a slow burn and a slow erosion that started with a couple of trips here or a couple of things there. And then, for me, it was that wake-up call of, wow, everything that I thought I wanted in terms of notoriety and success and all these things, is so fleeting and so unfulfilling. What I really crave and what I really desire is time with my relationships and investment in that. And I had a friend of mine say to me, the deepest form of intimacy is to be known and to know. And so he was really just talking about, that you see those couples together where they can almost complete each other's sentences. And those are the things for me. And I'm very quick to say in the book as well, look, if you and your significant others or you and your family, whoever that familiar or relationship unit looks like, say, hey, what our desire is this. Who am I to question that you're doing it wrong? The mistake I made is I set my course and then told the closest of relationships, hey, when we get there, then we will have that time. And it wasn't anything I did verbally, but it was in my actions. And, my daughter busted me on that when she talked about bringing my laptop on vacation. And I said, I work before you wake up. She was a teenager at the time. And her response was, yeah, but then you spend the rest of the day thinking about what you worked on. And what she was really saying was, I want you present. Yep. And so I think that's when we think about success. We as business leaders and entrepreneurs become selfish if we only define it through our own context and tell our relationships to take a back seat.
All right, today's growth story revolves around search engine marketing, and we'll be shining the spotlight on Aegis Software, a company that makes software for manufacturing operations. Aegis was one of the first companies in their space to invest in search marketing, but as competition grew, their performance plateaued. To counter this, they hired Directive Consulting, the B2B search marketing agency. With unparalleled experience in inbound lead gen for B2B companies, Directive was able to increase Aegis's monthly online leads by 457%, while at the same time lowering their cost per lead by 147%. Now I have a hunch that Directive can get these kind of results for you too. So head over to directiveconsulting.com and request a totally free custom proposal. That's directiveconsulting.com. All right, let's get back to this interview.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great second point there. We talked about defining success from your own terms and not just based on what you see from society or just the momentum of your career, but taking time to do it thoughtfully. And then what I hear you saying there as well is we can't just define it on our own terms, either intentionally or unintentionally, as you've talked about there, and then just push that onto our family as you're talking about how you've defined success for yourself. You're not saying that that definition is equal for everyone, but everyone needs to take the time to think about that definition. And I think that's something that everybody can gravitate towards. The next thing I wanted to have you kind of unpack, Carlos, is this idea of identity. So we've talked about, the definition of success. There's also this theme in the book of what your identity is tied to and some of the lessons that you learned along the way. What would you like to share with listeners on that point?
Yeah, I think it's such an easy trap to fall into placing our identity and our worth into our career accomplishments. I know I did it for the longest time. When I was landing deals on stage, when I saw my name on a book, boy, I was doing great. Give me 2 lost deals in a row or a speaking engagement I didn't think. That voice of shame was just telling me how bad I sucked. Yeah. And one of the things I realized, and here's the thing, I find this struggle especially true in men. And so for me, I really had to take a hard look and say, first of all, why am I looking to my career? Why am I looking to my profession to identify me? The fact is that all of us have worth and identity because we have a spark of the divine. And I stole that line from Kelly Flanagan, who wrote an awesome book called Lovable. And that is what makes us worthy. So it doesn't matter what I'm doing for a job or if I'm climbing the ladder of quote unquote success. It just matters, am I true to myself? Now, does that mean I should be like, oh, I don't care? No, I think there's some nobility in hard work. But for us to place all of our self-esteem and self-worth, and so what we're constantly doing is we're when we do that, we're fighting this voice of shame, which loves to tell us how inadequate we are, or, hey, you're so, you would have won that deal if you were smarter. And so now I've adopted what Brene Brown calls the shame resilience, and I embrace the and, where yes, I lost that deal, and I'm still successful, I'm still loved, I'm still worthy, so on and so forth. Rather than going, oh man, I really sucked, and I this, and Brian Kramer, who wrote the foreword for the book, he talks about stop shoulding all over yourself, SHOULD, right? So if we constantly go back and, I should have done this, or I should have done that, or it should be better, we beat ourselves down. And again, I think our professions are great, and most of them are very noble in what we do. I think as marketers, we have a noble profession, but it shouldn't define us. It shouldn't make us wrestle with shame and such. And I think that's what screws with our ability so much in terms of identification.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it screws with our ability. It screws with our mental state, both at work and at home. It's not like doing that, beating ourselves up, makes us better professionals. It's hurting us there while it's hurting our relationships as well. There were two things that you really touched on there, Carlos, that I have to kind of camp out on. Mm-hmm. I saw this TED or TEDx talk recently about the power of gamification. And there were these studies done where people were given a test or a quiz. And when they were given the results, there was a different reaction versus when it was phrased as a game versus when it was phrased as a test. And, the extreme example is, he's someone like me who grew up playing Mario. Is like when you died playing Nintendo or whatever game platform, depending on your generation, right? And you fell in a hole or died or got hit by that turtle, you didn't say, oh, I'm just a horrible Nintendo player. I'm just horrible. No, you learned from that experience and you just took it, right? It just rolled off your back. But we tend to internalize those things, those successes and failures much more. But when we have this mentality of, I'm just pressing on towards whatever goal that I'm trying to get to, which is why the first takeaway you talked about in defining success, if your life is a game of Mario, then what is getting to the princess in your terms, right?
Right.
That's, again, why that's important. And the other thing you touched on there is, man, that ugly head of pride, right? We're having a pretty real, authentic conversation here about, some very personal topics, more so than we typically do. So I'll try and share a little bit from my perspective. I've been in B2B sales for 10 years, and I know that when I'm having, a bad month, bad quarter, whatever it is, marketers, salespeople alike, we're measured by certain metrics. If you're a founder and entrepreneur, like you said, landing those deals, those new clients. And I've seen that, right? When you internalize that and let that affect your self-worth, all of a sudden something's not going right at home or something like that. And you get on the defensive. And why is that, right? Because you feel like, oh, it's just being piled on. I'm a failure here. I'm a failure here. And then your family looks at you like, what are you talking about? I just said, why didn't you take the trash out?
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, it does. And foolishly, I think so many of us, and I did this for a long time, I adopted the George Costanza approach, if you're a Seinfeld fan, where you don't want those worlds to collide. And I'm one way in business, but I'm another way. And that is such a fallacy because you can't be, because we're one whole person. And so, one of the things that I did to really help sort through that is I went and sought professional help. I sat and continue to work with a friend of mine who he's become a friend of mine and a mentor of mine who's a therapist who helps me kind of sort through these things and really dives in to go, okay, you're saying this, but let's really go through and tell me what that's all about. And I think we've attached this stigma of, especially as entrepreneurs or business leaders, of we just got to suck it up and pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And, there was a lot of people in my life who kept saying to me, stop identifying yourself through your professional success because it's fleeting. It just doesn't last. And, you're putting yourself in things that just, yes, they matter only to a certain extent. But what really matters is, how do your kids view you as a dad? How does your wife relate to you as a husband? And how does all of that stuff? So, to me, it's just so, so important that we regulate that and understand it and know that it's never done, because that voice of shame is always just so ready to pounce the moment we give it an opening. And that's why, again, I ascribe to Brene Brown's shame resilience, because I don't know that it's ever truly defeated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a consistent battle, but having that mindset, I think, definitely helps. Another thing that you and I have talked about before, Carlos, is this definition around hustle. Talk to us a little bit about the way that you explain in the book and the way that you think about this difference between working hard and hustling, because I feel like we've done a pretty good job here of explaining that, you're not advocating for just giving up on professional success, but it's about taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture and being intentional. So within that context, explain a little bit about maybe why it's important to distinctly define these two different things and talk about them maybe in different seasons.
Yeah, I grew up playing sports. And so when you hustled in sports, it was always a good thing. You always got commended for your hustle. But much like we do as human beings, we have such a penchant for perversion. And so the term that I actually talk about, and we have a chapter in the book called The Deconstruction of Hustle Porn. And there is no doubt that porn in any way, shape, or form is destructive and toxic. And some of what is being put out there, and I will not mention names to protect the guilty, is destructive and toxic. So when you think of things like, as I mentioned, the 9-day or 6 days a week, 9 to 9 work hour, or the 95 hours a week to be successful, or as some of the sharks on Shark Tank talk about, 24/7, 365, because there's someone out there who wants to take your position. That is so unhealthy. It's so lopsided. It is not sustainable. And there's actually studies that are shown that once you get past a certain number of hours per week, and I love the researcher, and I quote her in the book, where she says, you're actually not working smarter, you're working dumber. And so we as human beings, we're finite. We reach a point of diminishing returns. And so let's say we adopt this 95-hour work week. And I don't have I write about the percentages in the book, and I don't have them committed to memory. But even if you only sleep then 40 or 4 hours a night, now you're at 28 plus 95. Where do you have time for yourself or your relationships? And so I believe that constructive hustle or organized hustle. So there are weeks in my year where I know, and I sit down and Suzanne and I talk, and I go, hey, this night I'm either going to get up really early tomorrow at like 5 a.m. and crank some things out. That's hustling, right? I'm cranking some things out, but it's all planned and it's all within a boundary that I've established to make sure that I'm not doing that day in and day out like I used to, because right? I had to invest in that quote unquote identity. So I think, again, there's nobility in working hard, but what I have been able to do is construct boundaries. And so I have certain boundaries when I'm working, and when I am working, like I am locked in, I am dialed in, that is what I'm doing, that is where my focus is, and I don't have those distractions. But when I'm invested in my personal relationships and my hobbies and those things that I know are also very life-giving to me, I don't let work intrude. Now, hustlers don't agree to that, right? We have this work-life blend or this work-life harmony where I'll step away from a family dinner to take a phone call. All I'm telling my family is, you're not as important, right? That phone call is. So I think we have to differentiate that, and setting boundaries helps. But this hustle 24/7, 365, however you want to define it, this always on, and our phones are glued to us at all times. Yeah, that's not working hard. That's hustling, and it's toxic.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of weeks ago, and admittedly, I haven't stuck to this since then. But this was a definite rarity for me. All day on a Saturday, I looked at my phone, which unfortunately is on my nightstand. There's studies that show getting the phone out of the bedroom is good for our mental state and these boundaries, those sorts of things. But I looked at it, and usually what I do is check, see if there's anything good to respond to, right? Because you get that boost of, hey, that client got back to me, or whatever the case might be, or
right.
This post is doing well, or whatever. did not resisted the urge to even physically touch it. And it was face down, left it there for the entire day until about 7 that night. And then, checked some things. And you know what? Life went on, right?
Imagine that.
And I literally had conversations with my family that went differently. My attentiveness was different because, we think that we can step away and then step right back. But like, as your kids even pointed out, as you mentioned earlier, there's that switching cost, right? It takes us time to disengage and re-engage in different activities. So one, this idea that we can multitask all the time, which a lot of millennials like myself, me included, have bought into at times, just doesn't work. We have this diminishing return once we get to a certain point. So recognizing that is just not this philosophical stance. It's based in science, right?
Yeah, let me respond to that. What you're talking about, there's a value in presence. So literally just the other night, because I'm heading out of the country for a week to do some business. And again, people go, oh, well, that seems really unbalanced. We're actually planning for that because we knew it's been coming. So we're planning some time that I'm going to give back and take off so I can connect, right? It doesn't mean I don't ever travel, but I was on the couch. It was probably about 8:30 at night. And I make it a practice where pretty much after 6 o'clock, 6:30 at night, I'm off the grid. I don't work. I don't, because, and for me, I have to put those kind of boundaries. I don't work weekends, but I picked up my phone about 8 o'clock and I checked, and my wife was like, so, what are you doing? And I said, oh, just checking a work email. And she said, hey, I'm just bringing it to your attention. She's like, this is night number 2 where you've checked work email. And it wasn't a nagging thing, but because I've asked her, I'm like, look, I want to build these boundaries in community. I don't want to be the barometer of if I'm being present or not. And I said to her, my exact words, I said, that's fair. That's absolutely fair. And thanks for pointing that out, because she was right. And I've invited her into being part of that community that holds me fast to these boundaries. And really the value of presence is I can't be on my phone looking at work email and involved in a conversation. And so what I try to do is just put my phone away. I don't need it. We're addicted to it.
Yeah.
And like you experienced, you came back on Saturday and the world was still spinning on its axis. Sweetfish didn't go out of business. You weren't without a job, and you were able to engage with your wife and your children in a way that you wouldn't have if you had your phone in your back pocket and kept feeling the buzz every time an email came through.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, don't set yourself up for that torture, right? And the other thing that I've heard Michael Hyatt talk about recently in goal setting and in personal and professional goals is that, he advocates for not setting goals at the beginning of the year, all for December 31st at the end of the year,
right,
because of this idea that work expands to fill the time allotted. And so if we have this mentality of always on, always hustle, 24/7, then we'll find something to do. But really, if that's a 40-hour week or 50-hour week or whatever that is for you, when you set those clear boundaries, you will actually be more productive in 100%. Those 40 hours than you would be in those 65 at times. And there's science to back that up. I love that, you have research to that point in the book. Carlos, I could go on this topic for a while, man. I really appreciate you taking some time to chat with me. And I just love that we got to have the conversation, let alone share it with listeners. So people who are nodding their head along on this conversation, they want to dig in more to this topic. Maybe they want to find the book. It's available for pre-order now, right? What's the best place for people to either follow up with you or get their hands or their headphones on the book, whichever way they like to consume their content there?
Yeah, so the official release date will be June the 24th. You can find that on Amazon and just about any other online book retailer. The pre-order is active right now, so you can also do that through Amazon, or you can go to, if you just want to read more about my story and kind of synopsis of the book, you can go to theunamericandream.com. You can email me at carlos@theunamericandream.com. Hit me up on Twitter at CA Hidalgo, Hidalgo, or follow the UnAmerican Dream on Twitter as well. So really appreciate this. And obviously it's something that I'm passionate about, and really just hope that we as business leaders, for ourselves and for our teams, start to embrace a culture that says, enough with the hustle and let's get back to those things that are truly life-giving. So thanks for the opportunity, Logan. Always enjoy talking with you.
Yeah, likewise, Carlos. Appreciate it so much, man.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.